Detective work. I got out my map and that helped a lot. In a circle around Radnau, there were 50 major cities where B might be speaking. Nuremberg, Dresden, Berlin, Kiel, Hamburg, Bremen, Essen, Köln, Frankfurt, Heidelberg, and Stuttgart, to mention just a few. There would have been nothing to it if Billy Graham had been out there touring, but how the devil was I supposed to track down the speaking engagements of a virtual unknown named B? Finding no inspiration in geography, I spent some time wondering who Charlie is. A civilian, surely. As people will, I conjured up a big figure to fit the voice. I put him at age 35, wiry, of middling height and weight, some sort of military or paramilitary type with a rat-like face and cheap clothes dating from the 1950s. As is evident from all this, Charlie had failed to win my affection. I toyed briefly with the idea of calling Father Loufra and asking what the deal was, but couldn't find a shadow of an argument to support it. If Charlie knows where B is, what does he gain by withholding this information from me? If he wants to make me look bad, why call me and give me hints? On the phone he tried to sell me an explanation for these mysteries. He was dealing with a lazy schoolboy. I'd done my homework poorly, and he wasn't there to give me the right answers. He was there to give me a taste of the stick. That makes sense if he really is a military type. He's treating this like boot camp. Okay. As far as I can see, there's only one fact in everything he told me that is both hard and relevant. Wherever else B and the girl go, they eventually end up back in Radnau. I have to assume this is the best information Charlie has. If he knew for a fact that B is going to spend the summer in Spitsbergen, for example, he certainly wouldn't give me all this diz-daz about Radnau. If I'm right about this, then Charlie himself is headed for Radnau. And that, I suppose, is what he called to tell me. Isn't it grand to be educated? Saturday, May 18th, Radnau. Departing after a late leisurely breakfast, I was in Hamburg by mid-afternoon. Germany is smaller than Montana, and traveling from one end of it to another on the high-speed intercity express makes it seem even smaller. Having a couple hours to kill before making a connection to Radnau, I visited the tourist office at the Hauptbahnhof, and I was earnestly advised not to miss the Jungfernstieg, an easy walk away which would give me the city's magnificent artificial lake on the one hand and its most elegant shops on the other. I took the advice, and there it was, by golly, exactly as advertised. Not much of Radnau predates the 1940s. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and technocrat-in-chief, had something or other in mind for it during the late stages of the war, but certainly not a fine arts center. I think it was going to be a place where factories would really feel at home during the Thousand-Year Reich. Now it's a sprawling industrial park dotted with apartment complexes, indistinguishable from barracks. The only good things my guidebook could find to say about the hotel where I'd booked was that it was modern and scrupulously clean, and it was both of those. It was also downtown, which is to say in the older part of the city. Old Radnau doesn't even pretend to be quaint. I'd spent my time on the train making a readable longhand copy of The Great Forgetting to send to Father Loufra. When I checked in at the hotel, I asked the desk clerk if they had a fax machine, and he drew himself up as indignantly as if I'd asked about indoor plumbing. I'm glad I had a fax to placate him with. I'm going to have a bath, a long meditative dinner, meditating about as few things as possible, and perhaps a stroll before bed. No more than that. No work till tomorrow. A long night begins. As I said I might, I took myself out for a walk after dinner. The night was pleasant, the streets were quiet. I'm not a big explorer. About 3 blocks out, in other words, near the limit of my adventurousness, I heard a mild sort of hubbub somewhere ahead. If this had been Beirut, naturally, I would have just turned around and gone back to the hotel. But since it was Radnau, I was curious. I let the noise guide me to a nearby side street where a small theater was being picketed by 40 or 50 citizens, who seemed rather stunned to find themselves employed in such a vulgar display of rowdiness. They were milling about it in an undisciplined way, parading crudely, scrawling signs to non-existent witnesses, and half-heartedly chanting slogans whose exact wordings were still being worked on. It took me about 3 seconds to realize that I'd found B, or at least the site of his next gig. A favorite activity among the sign makers was to publish the supposed meaning of B's name. Thus he was named as the blasphemer, the bastard, the bunghole, the big mouth and blowhard, the bonehead, le bodard, le bête, le bobard, le boucher, le bruit, der Berigingung, der Bettler, and die Blattern, among others I no longer recall. Still, others identified him as Beelzebub, the Beast, Belial, and Barabbas, and 2 or 3, ignoring the initial problem altogether, confidently dubbed him the Antichrist, which I must say surprised me on the basis of what I knew so far. Really, the whole thing surprised me. The theater entrance was being defended by a uniformed guard who looked both more fierce and more worried than I thought necessary under the circumstances. The only rule he seemed to be enforcing for admittance was that the protest signs had to be left outside. Watching the traffic at the door, I soon saw that the procedure was to picket for a while, then to go in and heckle the speaker for a while, then to come back out and picket some more. I pushed my way in. First I took in the fact that the lecture hall wasn't very large, seating some 300 or 400. Then I took in the much more important fact that the hecklers were definitely not putting their hearts into their work. Perhaps it's true that Germans are uncomfortable defying authority. The first 20 rows pretty clearly held B's supporters, looking sullen and tense, while behind them and everywhere else were arrayed his glowering but largely silent antagonists. There was an empty seat near the front, and I headed for it after grabbing a stack of handbills to use as writing paper. I was disappointed to see that, except for B, the stage was empty. B lifted his eyes to mine as I sat down, and an electric charge of recognition flashed between us, or so I imagined. He was sideways to the audience, slouching against the podium and leaning forward to bring his lips to within a millimeter of the microphone. I bother with these details in an effort to recreate the impression he gave of being entirely indifferent to the conditions that might have silenced or intimidated other speakers. For while the hecklers were not very noisy, their hostility was palpable. His hands were still and relaxed, and he wholly focused on his thoughts, which he was sharing with the audience as intimately and spontaneously as if in private conversation. I'd no idea how long he'd been talking, but as I listened I began to recognize familiar ground within the great forgetting. But though the ground was familiar, it was less extensive. In other words, this was just a review. Eventually he paused and sent his eyes deliberately around the auditorium. "Tonight," he said, "I'd like to talk to you about the boiling of a frog." I uncapped my pen and started taking it down.